to the next session on mission perspective and practical applications by Dr. Varghese Phillip, who also spoke yesterday on God's call, the invitation to experience blessing and our response to his call, and also that God is the promise teller and the promise keeper. For those of you who are joining for the first time, I would like to give a brief introduction about Dr. Varghese Phillip. Dr. Varghese Phillip did his undergraduation and post-graduation in general surgery from CMC Vellore. He is married to Dr. Nirmala, who works in the field of anesthesia, and they were a part of the founding team which started the Asha Kiran Hospital in Orissa, as we saw yesterday. Currently, he is also the chairman of EMFI. I would request Dr. Varghese Phillip to lead us on to the next session. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's a privilege again to be with you this evening. Yesterday, can we have the presentation, please? Yeah. Yesterday, we looked at the theme of the God who calls. And I stress the fact that we are looking at the character of God who is calling us. Next slide, please. We looked at 4 dimensions of the call, or rather, it is 4 dimensions of the God who calls. And we based our study on the book of Genesis. And today we will continue with that study. Yesterday we looked at Genesis, the beginning portion from 1 to 11, the creation story. And from there, we talked about the creator who calls. Then we looked at the portion about Abraham and we said it is the promise keeper who calls Abraham. And then today we will look at the third portion where God as a pursuer. And then we'll look at God's call to Joseph as the dream giver. So we said creation story is a general call. It is a call to every human being. It is a call for everyone. And then the call to Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph are specific calls which are different in many ways. Each call is different in how it is received and how they respond to these calls. And each one goes through the tension of reality of God versus the reality of the world. And that is where we see faith being expressed in real life terms. So we looked at the first portion and we said the key purpose of the creation, the goal of creation is to bring everything under the headship of Christ. That is the purpose of creation. And we looked at it from Ephesians chapter 1, verses 9 to 10. We looked at the call of Abraham and we explored how God is the promise giver and the promise keeper. And we said in the face of impossibility of the call or the contradictions inbuilt in the call of God, we need to consider the verse that God tells Abraham, is there anything too hard for the Lord? And that is the verse that we need to ask ourselves when we face very difficult choices. When God calls us in one direction and the reality points us to another direction. Next slide, please. Then we looked at this definition of blessing, because blessing is very closely related to the call. We said the most important aspect of blessing is God's presence with us. And that is the most important treasure we have, that is God residing in us. His presence is the ultimate security for us. It is the ultimate joy for us. And this is what gives us the ultimate purpose in our life as well. And we said the other aspect of the definition of blessing is that we as human beings respond by kneeling down in worship. Worship, we said, was not singing a song in a church, though it could mean that as well, but it is basically surrendering to God. It is surrendering to God in trust. That is what our response is. That is the only response that is required from us. That is to trust God for what His presence continues to do in our midst. Next portion, next slide, please. So we want to summarize yesterday's session by these three statements that God's greatest gift and His blessing to us is His presence. And I think we should never forget that truth, that His presence is what is the best blessing that we can ever have. And the second is that God is calling you to be involved in uniting everything under the headship of Christ. We looked at some examples of how missionaries who have tried to bring people from different remote regions into the headship of Christ. That is the mandate that God has given us. And then we looked at Abraham and said, God is calling you to depart. Departure is a fundamental call to all of us. Departure from the old to the new, departure from old relationships to new relationships, departure from old desires to new desires, to a radical newness. So today we look at Jacob's story. Let's go to the next slide. Jacob's story, it's a complicated story that we have in Jacob. God's pursuit of Jacob begins even before he is born. We'll just read the portion, Genesis chapter 25, verses 21 to 23. If you have your Bibles, please do turn to this portion. Genesis chapter 25, verses 21 to 23. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is so, why then am I this way?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples will be separated from your body. And one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." That was the initial call of Jacob, as it were, that God chooses him before even he was born. You can see Jacob holds his brother's heel as he comes out second. He's the younger one. And you can see the differences between them. Esau is the older one, and he is his father's favorite. He is a hunter, an agile person, an outside person, an adventurer, a good cook as well. He could cook meat, the hunted meat, very well. And the younger one, Jacob, is his mother's favorite. He is always at home, and he turns out to be a deceiver as well. Very sharp. He can think forwards many times forwards, and he can anticipate things in the future, and he can act today. So he is very intelligent, but very good at deception. So the contrast between them is really startling. It becomes all the more intense when parents play a favorite. Father liked the older son and mother liked the younger son. So the conflict becomes even more intense as they go through. So, as you know, Jacob steals his brother's birthright, and then, along with his mother's collusion, he steals the blessing from his father, and he had to flee. We are not sure if Jacob knew the importance of blessing, but certainly his mother knew the importance of blessing. Mother knew the implications of that blessing that transmitted all the way from Abraham through Isaac, and now she wanted that to be given to Jacob, her favorite son, not to Esau. She wanted to make sure Jacob, her favorite son, gets the Abrahamic blessing of promise for descendants and generations to come. After getting that blessing through deception, Jacob had to run away. Next slide, please. So, Jacob's first encounter as he runs away uh, with God is somewhere not even halfway, much before halfway. So he encounters God while he was sleeping at night. You know that portion where he keeps a rock as his pillow and he sees a dream. In that dream, there is a stairway open from heaven and angels going up and down on the stairway, and God standing beside him. That was his first encounter. First of all, God is giving him a great vision, a ladder connecting heaven and earth, angels going up and down, God standing beside him. God wants to dwell with Jacob and his descendants. He wants heaven and earth to be united. This is what God wants to do for us. Open up the stairway to heaven when He calls us. He wants heaven and earth to be united. He wants His presence to be felt beside us, within us. That is what is indicated in this dream. But Jacob really does not understand the gravity of this vision. As you can see in this encounter, God says, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. What does Jacob respond with? He says, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, the Lord will be my God. You can see how transactional Jacob is. He starts with if you will do this for me. His ask is very ordinary. Just give me food and clothes and safety, and you will be my God. That's what he says. His response is conditional. He is uninterested in the larger purposes of God. Notice here the way he addresses God. I have put in brackets, if God, Elohim, Elohim is the Hebrew word for a generic term for God, Elohim. Then he says, if Elohim does all this for me, then the Lord, Yahweh, my personal God, will be my God. He says, if you do all this for me, you will be my personal God. He says, I will accept you as God if you will do all this for me. Aren't we like this very often? We tell God, God, if you do this, I will do this for you. If you do this, if you get me through the exams, if you get me through NEET, if you get me a good job, if you get me a good paying job, if you get me a good wife or a husband, I will do this for you. I will go to the mission field, or I will do this and that for you. Very often we are transactional. I am transactional. And I'm sure many of us are transactional in our interaction with God. But God, He stays with Him. He stays committed to Him. Let's go to the next slide. So God, in pursuit of a deceiver and a deal maker. How do we understand this God? How do we understand God pursuing a deceiver? How do we understand a God who pursues a deal maker, who chooses a deal maker and uses him for his purposes? How do we understand God pursuing us? How do we understand God choosing us for his work? Yesterday, there were many questions asked about inadequacy. I am inadequate. How will I fit in a mission situation? I am guilty. I am sinful. How do I fit in a mission situation? The only way we can understand this is through the lens of grace. Only grace can help us understand what it means for God to pursue us. Grace is what Jesus showed us. It is in pursuit of the unworthy, of the abhorrent, and the morally bankrupt. That's what we are. Yet, God pursues us. Yet, Jesus pursues us. Yet, grace pursues us. Paul summarizes this in his letter to Corinthians. It is actually an inversion of the natural order. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27-29, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. So God deliberately chooses those things that are worthless, those things that are morally bankrupt, deceivers, deal makers, unworthy people, people who don't deserve the blessing of God. He chooses deliberately them and makes them a blessing for others. It is the inversion of the natural order. As we see here itself, Jacob is the younger one, and by inheritance, it is the older one that has to receive the promise. But it is the younger one whom God chooses. And we see in a similar idea of inversion of the natural order in Mary's song in Luke chapter 1. When Mary is carrying Jesus, she blesses God and says, He has scattered those who were proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down the rulers from their thrones. He has exalted those who were humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. This is the inversion that happens when we follow God. Those who think they are chosen, those who think they deserve God's blessing, are the very ones that are rejected by God. We see the example in the Pharisees in Jesus' days. We can only kneel in worship in response to such an unmerited favor that God showers on us. Let's go to the next slide, please. So after 20 years, Jacob stays in his uncle Laban's house. He flees again. 20 years, we see the power of blessing in Jacob and in Laban's household. Jacob's animals, they multiply, and Laban also becomes rich. Both become prosperous. That is the power of blessing we see. But then there are conflicts. Jacob flees with his wives and children, cattle and sheep and other animals. So as he's fleeing, he has to now face Esau. Esau was about to murder him when he left his birthplace. Now he has to face him when he gets back to the promised land. He is afraid. There he prays to God. And in Genesis chapter 32, God confronts Jacob. We won't go into all that portion, but there he wrestles hard with a man, possibly an angel or God himself. And he says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So God is continuing to be engaged with Jacob. And there, what do you see? Jacob is still a deal maker. He says, bless me. He says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. He is still a deal maker. He hasn't changed too much of his habits. But God says, you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. God accepts him as a man who is in pursuit of God. Let's go to the next one. It is at that point in time that three things happen at that brook of Jacob, brook of Jabbok that night when he has fought with this person, perhaps God. And there Jacob is turned to Israel. He gets a new identity. A new identity for Jacob, a Jacob which means a heel catcher or a usurper, becomes Israel. God prevails. God rules. Now onwards, it is God who prevails and God who rules in the life of Jacob. It's a new identity for Jacob, that from now on, it is God who rules in his life and God who will prevail for him in all the battles he undertakes. He doesn't have to deceive, he doesn't have to fight. It is God who will undertake battles for him. That is the changed perception of for Jacob. He didn't have to deceive and catch others' heels to achieve his blessing. Now God will do it for him. He'll have to just rest in God's promises. Second thing that happens to him is hip dislocation. He cannot run away anymore. He has to face Esau soon. He cannot run away from him who is about to kill him. He has to only depend on God. That's the whole point of grace, to depend on God and to nobody else. God brings those fears and travails and difficulties to drive us against the wall to himself. That's what God does. Then thirdly, Jacob wants to know God's name. For the very first time, he is responding to God, wanting to know his name. He wants to know who this God is who's been pursuing him. It took him so long to want to know God's purposes for him. He only wanted his food and clothes and safety in the beginning. God pursued him till he brought him to a point where Jacob asked him, what is your name? Now Jacob takes on that desire to know God and God's purposes for him. Knowing God's name is to understand in some way who this God is and how that God relates to me. Next slide, please. So the story of Jacob is a interplay of the deceiver and the God who calls. Jacob tries to grab blessing through deception and tries to do things his own way. And how God works through those deceptions to fulfill his purposes and bring Jacob into a full-fledged relationship with him. Jacob wanted God to provide for his needs, but he comes to a point where he wants only God, God's name. And God deals with him uh, through an outpouring of his grace. That's what we saw. Through an outpouring of his grace is how God dealt with him. Jacob finally ends up acknowledging God as his shepherd. We see towards the last chapters of Genesis, when he is with all his children. Joseph is there, all his children are there. He blesses them. And he says in chapter 48, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they increase greatly upon the earth." So he comes to a point where he acknowledges God as his shepherd, God as the one who leads. And finally, we see in one last scene, we see in Hebrews, if we don't see it in Genesis, in chapter 11, verse 21, pursued by that grace of God, he says, in Hebrews chapter 11, it says, "By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff." Truly a blessing, as we discussed in the earlier slides, a blessing where he kneels down in worship, leans on the top of his staff, and blesses God. Thanks God for all that he has done for him. So he will not let you go, just like he did not let Jacob go. His mercies, his grace follow you, even through the ups and downs, even through all the faults and all the anything that you would have done. God sticks with you. God pursues you till you, as Jacob did, till you lean in worship and say, "You are my shepherd." Next slide, please. Let's look at the next dimension of the call, and that is Joseph. God calls Joseph as the dream giver. Dream giver calls Joseph. Here, unlike all the other calls, the caller is hidden. We don't see the caller speaking to the one called. Caller is hidden throughout that episode. Only in retrospect do we know that it was God who had put that dream. And it was God who was fulfilling that dream all through in Joseph's life. Joseph was only a 17-year-old teenager when he had that dream, much like many of you who are there today. In contrast, when God called Abraham, Abraham was 75 years old. And when God appeared to Jacob, he was 77 years old. So God gives him a dream, and that dream becomes a matter of severe contempt for his brothers. His brothers cannot stand that dream that Joseph talks about. And that is the nature of dreams. Dreams belong to another reality, a reality which others cannot understand or accept. So others try to dismantle the dream through cynicism and disbelief. And if that doesn't work, it can even get physical with a violent reaction. A dream worth pursuing will always have detractors, will always have people who will say, that is not a good dream, that is not worth pursuing. They will do all they can in their powers to put that dream down. You remember the speech that Martin Luther King made, a speech which is called I Have a Dream. And he talks about his dream of both the white and the blacks living together in harmony, the children of both whites and blacks studying together, going to school together. And he paints a fantastic picture of a world living in harmony. You know, others could not stand that dream. They try to block it. They try to hinder it. Those who could not accept it, they could not visualize it. They reacted violently. Finally, he was killed. All because he dreamt a dream that belonged to another reality. That is the nature of the dream. Next slide, please. So the dream bearer is put in a well by his brothers, thinking that the dream will end in the well. That is the most decisive event in Joseph's life. He is put in the well. Here in this painting, many centuries old, you can see Joseph being traded like a slave with the traders. You can see in the background money being exchanged. Further in the background, you see camels of traders, some trading in animals in the background. So it's a trade that happens, a slave trade. So from the well, he goes to the slave traders. From there, he goes to um, Egypt. So there are always those who want to bury you and your dream. The question is whether the dreamer will have enough perseverance to go on, even when everything is going in the opposite direction. So the key question for us to understand here is that what made Joseph to remain faithful to that dream that he was given? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we get a glimpse of what sustained him when we look at his response in each of the situations that he faced. I've listed it here in these verses. So when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, he says, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" When Pharaoh's officials who were jailed along with Joseph have dreams and they were unable to interpret it, he says, do not interpretations belong to God? And then later when Pharaoh asks Joseph if he can interpret his dream, he says, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then after Pharaoh narrates his dream, he says, God has shown you to Pharaoh, shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And in the context of the repeated dream that Pharaoh has, he says, the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. And then when Joseph has his first son born, he says, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. And then when his second son is born, he says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And then after Jacob's death, his brothers were afraid that Joseph would harm them. And he assures them and says, God meant it for good, though you meant it for harm. So you can see how the word God is the common thread through all these statements. These verses indicate the depth to which he understood God. The thoughts of God and his closeness with him permeated all his life, his conversations, and his actions. Even when he was in the well, even when he was being traded, the only thing that sustained him, that kept him going, was the fact that he knew God was with him. And that was what gave him the courage. A 17-year-old, imagine a 17-year-old going through all these difficulties and afflictions, being traded like a slave in a foreign land. And it is that kept that dream alive and going. So, so trust in the God of his fathers helped him right through not just the painful moments, but also the enticements that he faced in the seclusion of Potiphar's house. So his understanding of the God of his father, of his grandfather and great-grandfather was what sustained him. Let's go to the next slide, please. But reading the account of Joseph may give us the impression that God gave him the dream and then abandoned him, because we don't hear God speaking to him ever. We do not see God speaking to Joseph or any tangible evidence of God's intervention. On the contrary, we suspect if God is still interested in Joseph at all as he goes through all these trials. But unknown to God, unknown to Joseph, God's presence is with Joseph. When he is put inside the well, God's presence is with him when he is pulled out from the well, and when he is sold as a slave, when he is marched across the desert to Egypt. God is with him when he is put on the sale in the slave market. God is with him when he in the Potiphar's house. God is with him inside Potiphar's bedroom. God is with him when he is thrown into the jail and when he is taken out. God is with him as he interprets the dreams. And God is with him when he rules over Egypt, and so on till the very end. God is with him. How do we know God is with him? And you can see from the account, if you read the account of Joseph, everything he touches, God blesses. He blesses Potiphar's house. He blesses the jailer and the jail. He blesses Pharaoh. He blesses Egypt with provision for food during famine. And he blesses the surrounding nations. In a sense, part of the promise made to Abraham is fulfilled in Joseph, in blessing the nations around. So we say with Paul in Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. What a beautiful verse. Nikki Gumbel says, the book of Romans is like the Himalayas of the Bible, and chapter 8 is the Mount Everest. It is the most beautiful verse in that Mount Everest. The very peak of Mount Everest is here, Romans 8:28. And Joseph experienced that very, very intimately, that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God. Next slide, please. So we may ask the question, is human action irrelevant? It looks as if Joseph just went through the motions. Is human action irrelevant? Joseph's uh, brothers could not destroy his dream. The well could not bury his dream. Potiphar's wife could not hold back the dream. Jail could not contain the dream. Nothing could annihilate that dream till Joseph's father and brothers came to him. They literally bowed down before him. But what did Joseph do in all this? He trusted God. I think that trust, that surrender to God's purposes is what is needed in all of our lives. As the wise man says in Proverbs chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean onto your own understanding. In all your ways, even when you're going through all kinds of trials and troubles, acknowledge Him and He will make your path straight. So persevere with the dream that you have. It is He who guards it. It is not you who guard it. He will guard it and bring it to completion. But make sure that dream is from God. Make sure that you are faithful to the dream that God has given you. I will now share two examples of people who have dreamed and how their dreams have um, changed the destiny of people and nations, and their dreams continue to change people. Next slide, please. This is a story of the organization that I'm now working with. It's called Mission Aviation Fellowship. It began with the dream of one person, uh, the pilots. They were they were from New Zealand, Murray Kendon and Trevor. They were two pilots. They were from New Zealand. They were in the Allied forces during the Second World War, bombing Germany and Paris during the last few months of the war, based out of England. So one day, Murray Kendon was flying over Paris with his bomber, and at night, he was flying over Paris. Suddenly, he saw flares coming from below. You know that flares mean that they are trying to identify where the plane is in the light of the flare so that they can shoot it down. Nowadays, they have lasers, but those days they did not have lasers. So he knew his flares are there below him, and he knew his life was in danger, and somehow he managed to escape and come back to England. That was a turning point in his life. He said soon after, within a few months, war was over, and he said, now onwards, I'm going to use the same tool that I used to bomb these nations, the plane, not to bomb others, not to destroy others, but to deliver help to people who need. So that is how Mission Aviation Fellowship was founded. So he dreamed of that, and he asked other pilots who were already out of job after World War II to join him, and a few of them got together and formed this Missionary Aviation Fellowship. And they got one plane, single plane. It was a small dream. God took it, blessed that dream, multiplied it, and now they are spread across the world. Now we work in about 33 different countries, mostly in Africa, South America, and in Pacific Ocean, several islands. And the main work of Mission Aviation Fellowship is to deliver help to people who are in remote regions in the name of Christ. Every pilot who is part of Mission Aviation Fellowship is a committed Christian. And one of the significant things that happened out of this, their small dream, was another incident. Next slide, please. There was a pilot who joined Mission Aviation Fellowship during that time. His name was Nate Saint. They were based in South America. And he and four other missionaries from other organizations, joined together and wanted to reach the most remote tribal people in South America, the Aucas. And you may have heard of them, Jim Elliot and the rest. So he flew them along with the four other missionaries to reach the Aucas for Christ. They landed on the riverbed and they were killed by the Aucas. Next slide, please. This is the newspaper cutting that appeared soon after their killing. Next slide, please. This is the state of the plane after Aucas destroyed it completely, tore it apart on the riverbed, and the 5 missionary bodies were in the riverbed and in water, and they were brought back later by the US Air Force. So you may have heard of these missionaries. Please read the book that one of the missionaries' wife wrote, Elizabeth Elliot wrote, Through the Gates of Splendor, about what happened really, and one of the earlier books about how they came to hear the call of God, that is called The Shadow of the Almighty. Please do read if you can get hold of these books. And today, next slide, please. This is a MAF plane operating in Africa in the among the Maasai tribal people in the Central African region. So MAF operates in many different places. So this small dream, which one person dreamt, became such a blessing to so many nations, so many people. And through the life of Jim Elliot and Nate Saint and others, so many young people were blessed, motivated to go to mission work in different parts of the world. And we have even a EMFI staff worker, Dr. Elliot here, who's been named after Jim Elliot, a matter of great significance for us. Next slide, please. The other person who dreamt that I want to talk about is Alex. Yesterday you heard the story of Asha Kiran. When we were all in Asha Kiran, Alex had finished his MBBS in Madurai. He was working in Odanchatram, and probably reluctantly he was working there, pushed by his friends to work there. There he committed his life to God and made a renewed commitment to missions. And he visited Asha Kiran and then visited the Bondo Hills. And he felt God telling him that I am giving you these mountains as an inheritance. And he took that as God's dream for him, God's call for him. And he straight away started doing everything to come there as a missionary. He got married to Hannah. Both of them came. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Both of them came and started working among the Bondo tribe. And here is Alex treating a Bondo woman. They lived in, the hut that you can see there. On the other side, you will see pigs staying, mud floor, hardly anything to um, to live by. But he and Hannah stayed there and worked among the Bondos. Through their work, they started educating children there. They, many of them, last month I had the privilege of speaking to many of them. Some have finished MPhil, MA, and MSc, and doing very well in different studies because of the work, the seed that was sown by Alex and Hannah. And unfortunately, God took him away at the age of 48, a couple of years ago. And this is a true meaning of a grain of wheat falling to the ground and dying, and which will bear much fruit. And we can already see much fruit happening among the hills. And through his life, many have been motivated to follow Christ. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I want to summarize what I have said thus far. So I think we need to consider it as an incredible mercy of God. Sorry, the typo there. Incredible mercy of God that He calls us. It is not because of our goodness or what we are or our talents that God calls us. It is the grace of God. It is the mercy of God that He calls us. And it is a privilege. Can you go back to that last slide, please? It is a privilege to be involved in the call of God. He calls us to bless us with His presence. That is the whole idea of um, God's call, that He wants us to experience Him, His presence. That is the whole idea of His call. The God who calls us remains committed to us through our doubts, through our anguish, and through our trials. And God's presence is the best security that we will ever have. And God's call God's call involves going. It is a very important aspect of call that we go from our previous life to a new life. And obeying the call of God and trusting Him is the only way you will find meaning and purpose in your life. So I want to end with a couple of suggestions for you. So you may ask, what can you do now when many of you are students? I would say start with reading biographies. Here is a biography of Alex that Hannah has written. It's called Beloved Alex, and you can get it from any staff. You can contact any of the EMFI staff and they'll be able to get it for you, or the staff can post the details on the chat here. It says biography of Dr. Alex Bondo missionary. Please do read this missionary biography and be inspired. He is one of us who worked just a few years earlier. And similar biographies are there of Jim Elliot. Please do read Jim Elliot's biography. And you can read some of the names I mentioned yesterday. Hudson Taylor, William Carey, written by Vishal Mangalwadi. Please do read all these books. They will inspire you. And secondly, visit mission fields, hospitals, where you go out into the communities and see what is going on there. As our teachers used to say when we were doing medicine, they used to say, what the mind cannot see what the eye does not see. Mind does not know what the eye cannot see, which means unless you go and see, you won't know what you want to do with your life, what God is calling you to. So go and see, go to the different parts of India. and see what's happening. Go to Bihar, go to Orissa, go to Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, where the needs are so heavy. Go to these tribal areas, see what's happening, and understand the needs, and then respond with your life. And thirdly, EMFI runs a program called IMM, Institute of Medical Missionary. And do enroll for that. Ask any of the staff. And if there are a group of people that you want to do it, tell EMFI that we are a group of people, we want to do this program for a week. And you'll get exposed to what's happening in the mission field. Real hands-on experience of working in the mission field. Do all that, and God will plant a desire in you, and you'll find that we have crossed 60. We'll find that the most meaningful thing that you can do in your life is to spend your life in the presence of God, doing what He has asked you to do, not what you pursue out of your own selfish desires or fulfilling your family's desires. No other desires are worth it except what God desires of you. May God bless you.